late. But so last week we discussed Baruch She'amar, and we talked about how there's two different elements that are brought up in the halacha, and they reflect two different elements in our own experience of Baruch She'amar. That on the one hand, Baruch She'amar is a blessing, a formal blessing, like a bracha and all those connotations throughout halacha. And as a blessing, what it's serving as is some form of either birchat ha-mitzvah or some form of blessing that's connected to the Psuki de Zimra. And it seems from the text of Baruch She'amar, we pointed out even more specifically towards the verses from Psalms, the chapters from Tehillim that are in Psuki de Zimra. Specifically, Baruch She'amar focuses on the songs of David, which we know are Tehillim, Psalms. So that was Baruch She'amar, and we talked about how one element is a blessing over Psuki de Zimra, and the other element is that it itself contains various praises of God. And Baruch She'amar itself is a song that's meant to be sung, that's meant to be enjoyed. We said that the poskim say it's supposed to be joyous, a happy experience. People used to sing it for an hour long. So we have these two competing values that on the one hand, it's a formal blessing. On the other hand, it's an emotional, of-the-moment expression, a song of how much we appreciate God, and that serves as our preface to Tehillim. What all of that is to bring us to today. Today we're finally going to get to the meat of Shirei David, the songs of David, the Psalms of David. We're going to get to maybe halachic Tehillim. We mentioned that before the Gemara says that halavai, it's a good thing that one should say verses of praise every single day. And Rashi there said, what verses of praise? Tehillim, the end of Tehillim specifically. Some of the chapters towards the very end. So after we finish Baruch She'amar, we transition into those ending chapters of Tehillim. Chapters 145 through 150, what we know as Ashrei and the Hallelujahs. Just to point out, before we say Ashrei, we actually preface Ashrei in our liturgy with a paragraph known as the Yihi Chavod, God's kavod, God's honor, Yihi Chavod Hashem Olam. Okay, so we preface it with this collection of verses. What's noteworthy of this phrase, of this paragraph of Yihi Chavod, the preface to Ashrei, is that it's actually not a chapter of Tehillim. It's not like the Hodus, a praise from somewhere else in Tanakh, in the Bible. It's actually an aggregate. It's a collection of different verses and different phrases that are being combined together. And most notably, actually, it really, as an aggregate, it originally was initiated as specifically an aggregate for days that emphasize the kavod, the holiness of Hashem. So, for example, we find some early sources say, here's the Chavod, and it's a prayer that's said on Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah is when we king God as the king. Other traditions, maybe the earliest tradition was only to say Chavod on Pesach, because Pesach is the day where we join the covenant with God, and He brought us out of our slavery, etc., etc. But what we see is the Chavod sort of begins as this of-the-moment collection of psukim that's supposed to express some beautiful idea about God, and then transition into the heart of the matter, into Ashrei. Over time, Chavod became a staple of the siddur. What usually happens with these things is that once they're included in the siddur, even if there's like a little thing above that says some congregations say them, over time they just get included and everybody says them all the time. So Chavod, that's now a part of the siddur, something we say all the time. I'm less interested in it just because the rabbis and Chazal don't talk about it, and it itself is not like a coherent set. It's a tradition of various psukim grouped together. Every nusach, every liturgy has their own tradition. So it's a little bit less of a well-established, coherent piece of liturgy. It's more of a transitionary collection of psukim. But that transitionary collection of psukim brings us to Ashrei. And that is the heart of the liturgy. So we see here, in source one, that brings us to Ashrei, a prayer that is probably relatively familiar to us in terms of how the liturgy goes. And again, as always, we'll save the more detailed investigation of what Ashrei says, understanding and translating the in particular words. We'll save all of that for the end, for the portion we save for our exercise together. But for now, just to highlight some of the themes of Ashrei, it opens up with Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, a praise of those who dwell in God's house. Not just a praise of God, but God is so great that even those who affiliate with Him are also praiseworthy. Sort of telling God, remember what's in it for us. We're your Yoshvei Beitecha, those who dwell in your house. From there, it goes on to various praises of God, and it features one of the most famous lines, and we'll get to this later on in our discussion today. Poteach et yedecha, open your hand, umaspia lechoch haratzon. You open your hand and you feed, you provide sustenance for all of life. So that's a very famous section. But that just punctuates that a lot of what we're doing here is praising God. Because this is Tehillim, it's Psalms, and this is part of Tefilah. So of course, a lot of what we're trying to accomplish is praises of God. That's what Ashrei is all about in a heartbeat, in a nutshell. And what we see, though, is beyond this, Ashrei is actually composed of three different sections. Now, while it's true that Ashrei at its heart is Tehillim Kuf Mem Hey, Psalms 145, the songs of David, that Psalm 145 actually begins with the phrase Tefilah David, a song of praise of David, and it ends with Tilat Hashem Yidaber Pi. But when we look at our Ashrei opens up with Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, not with Tilat David. It opens up with praiseworthy are those who sit in your house. Ashrei Ha'am Shekachalo, praiseworthy is the nation that this is theirs. And what's fascinating, honestly, is that this Ashrei, these praises, were added on early on. We're added on to this psalm. We're added on to Tehillim 145. First of all, to make it clearer what we're accomplishing, I think. To make it clear, we're establishing we're doing an Ashrei, we're doing a praise here. But beyond that, much like Baruch Shemar, this was taken as an opportunity for of the moment expressions of praise. That the Ashrei originally wasn't a uniformed Ashrei. It wasn't a liturgical one that everybody said the same thing. But to some extent, the Ashrei was a little bit up in the air. So first thing I want to look at together is the development of these psukim, of these verses that were added before Psalm 145 of what we know of the psukim of Ashrei, of praise to God. The two Ashreis, Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, praiseworthy are those who sit in your house, Ashrei Ha'am Shekachalo, praiseworthy is the nation. So our earliest record, the earliest instant we have of adding anything onto the Ashrei, of saying anything, really brings us all the way back to the Gemara itself. Because we know that Ashrei, again, unlike Yichavod, unlike some of the later developments in liturgy, Ashrei is really old. The minhag, the custom, the halacha of saying Ashrei, well recorded in religion.
What? Potato soup. Yeah, it's good.
So for example, now if we look in source number 3, we see that the Gemara tells us as follows. Chasidim Harishonim, the early pious people, the earliest devotees, Hayushoin Sha'a Achas. They used to come to shul an hour early, and they would wait an hour before prayers in meditation. So they would take an opportunity before they prayed. A sha'ah maybe means literally an hour, maybe not. It means a moment. We don't know how long that means, but they would take some substantial moment of time, and they would take that as preparation for prayer. Manahani Mirai, how do we know this? How do we know that there's a value, that it's a good thing to take a moment, sit down, and just absorb prayer, meditate before prayer? Amar Rabbi Yeshua Levi said, Amar Kra, the verse said, just a reminder to everybody, please mute yourself.
300.
Currently speaking. A reminder to mute.
No. No, I didn't feel like I.
Okay. So
it's going to be nothing big, not take much time.
Would you use a house that
Rabbi, you can.
Very comfortable talk.
I don't have the host code, but if someone who does take over the
Does
host
Jeff have it?
Oh, looks like French Chateau. Where is that?
English tutor.
English tutor.
It's waterfront on Maycox.
Okay.
Oh.
But in the meantime, we'll power through. Okay, so but what we see is so we have this minhag, this custom early on that people, the pious ones, the Hasidim, would arrive early to davening and meditate for a moment beforehand. And the Gemara says, how do we know this? What's the root for this custom? What's the basis for this minhag of meditation before prayer, of reflecting before prayer? Perfect. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, thank you so much for muting everybody. Amar Kra, the verse says, Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha. Praiseworthy are those who sit in your house. So the rabbis already look at this verse. They look at this phrase of those who sit in your house, of the Yoshvei Beitecha, and they take that. It doesn't just mean one who dwells, one who follows or worships God. It means one who sits in it, one who takes a moment to sit in silence before you pray. And that's found as the source for this custom of meditating before prayer. So just off the bat, this isn't about reciting Ashrei, but already Ashrei is being tied very early and very intrinsically to prayer. That the Tehillim of 145, the Ashrei, or really not 145, we're appending this, the verse of Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha of Psalms 84, that's being identified as a model for how one should prepare for prayer. From there, we see you should reflect. But what's interesting is that we go one step further, because Tosfos looks at this Gemara, which gives us a conceptual model for prayer, and he views it as a liturgical model, a liturgical basis. Because we see in Tosfos quotes this Gemara and says, Lefichach, therefore, since the pasuk of Ashrei teaches us that one should meditate, Tiknu lomar zeha pasuk kodem Tefilah David. The rabbis established that you should say the pasuk of Ashrei before you recite Psalms 145. La'afuke mehanehu da'amri Ashrei harbe. And this is all coming to preclude others who say other Ashreis. We'll get to that soon. We'll arrive there. But what we see from Tosfot is that the Gemara tells us there's a practice to meditate before prayer, and says we know that this is a value from the verse of Ashrei Yosher Letecha. Tosfot looks at our siddur and sees that we say Ashrei before Telem Kuf Mem Hey, and Tosfot says, oh, that must be why. That Ashrei is a moment of meditation. It's a moment of reflection, the opportunity to really get ready for prayer. And I think this is really very moving, very beautiful, and very fitting. Because we said, what is Ashrei? Ashrei is the meat and bones of Psukei Zimra. That it's the first psalm, the first of the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. And we'll see soon that both halachically and just generally liturgically, Ashrei gets an outsized focus as the heart of praise for God. That's how you praise God. That's how you do Psukei Zimra. You say Ashrei. Halacha is you get to shul and you're running late and you can't say all Psukei Zimra. What do you say? Baruch she'amar, Ashrei yishtabach. Because Ashrei is the heart of it. That is Psukei Zimra, and that's why we attach this need to meditate, to reflect. That's why we attach that reminder to Ashrei, our first opportunity to really take advantage of Psukei Zimra, engage in it, and reflect. So that's just the basic. How do we get up with this first verse? The first verse, based on the Gemara, according to Tosfot, teaches us the need to reflect. What's fascinating is that Tosfot adds a few words at the end of this comment here, where he says, La'afuke mehaneu da'amrei Ashrei harbe. And this position of mine is coming to argue against those people who say lots of Ashreis. So Tosfot says he's arguing against those who say lots of Ashreis by quoting, by his explanation of this Gemara. So it's a little cryptic what that means, but thankfully, we know we have the Machzor Vitri, a siddur from the time of Tosfot. And the Machzor Vitri, a siddur that came out of the school of Rashi. It's a little contested who exactly wrote it, who's responsible, but we know it was a general school of thought, the general yeshiva of Rashi. And the Machzor Vitri, we see that when it comes to Ashrei, there's actually multiple different psukim that begin with Ashrei being quoted here. Or perhaps not even psukim, maybe just expressions of praise. That, like we said, Baruch she'amar, the first half Baruch she'amar was opened with all these contemporaneous, of the moment expressions of praise. And on Shabbos they would say one thing, on Yom Tov they'd say a different Baruch she'amar. So to Ashrei would open with all these contemporaneous expressions of praise. There are all these different Ashreis. And that's what Tosfos is arguing against. Tosfos says, by the way, you guys shouldn't do this. Because Ashrei isn't like Baruch she'amar. It's not just an opportunity to express ourselves. The reason why we say Ashrei is because the Gemara tells us to. In Brachot Lamed Bet Amud Bet. That's what Tosfos is arguing. It's not just that Brachot 32b is a source for meditation. Brachot 32b is a source for the liturgy, that this is why we open with Ashrei and not with anything else. So from a historical halachic development perspective, I think that's pretty interesting to think about, that Tosfos is coming here and rejecting the siddur of the time, or at least one siddur, one possibility of the time, that other people were still changing Ashrei. That in the time of Rashi, already, 1,000, 1100s, people were still editing Ashrei, adding their own introductions to Ashrei, so that's very interesting. But I think also this reminds us, even if ultimately we don't paskin that way, is that a lot of tefillah and a lot of prayer, while now we're used to, we're in the mindset of mode, it's halachic, it has this very strict codification, it's very formalized, and of course that is true. I'm not advocating we should replace halachic prayer with individual contemporaneous prayer, but merely noting that even the halachic formal rigid prayer, for a lot of its history, was very fluid, was an expression of individual desire, of individual want, that you would open Ashrei with whatever you were feeling at the time. So I think that's something to remember, that we're not cheating when we try to make prayer more personal or more exciting. That's what it always was. Unfortunately, because of our exiled state, because of our scattered, our diasporic state, we need to unify things, we need to mainstream things, we need to make them simple. We need a siddur, we need a liturgy, we need to codify a law. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't also be striving to imbue that with individual meaning like it originally was. So that's just to point out that much like Baruch she'amar, so too we find in Ashrei that these opening verses are taken as an opportunity for personal expression, for personal praise. So far, so good. So that takes us through Ashrei, through the first couple of verses. We now can understand a little bit what's going on there. But now we get to Tefilah David, to Psalm 145. And Psalm 145 is really the focus here. As we mentioned, The Gemara, in passing, mentions the pasuk of Ashrei Yesher Techa, but the idea of reciting psalms in praise of God, that's Tehillim 145. That starts with the pasuk of Tefilah David, the praise of David. And of course, we know, just looking quickly, and this is something that'll come up in the Gemara, this praise, this chapter, Psalm 145, is an alphabetical psalm. It starts Aleph, really it starts with a Taf, because it starts with Tehilah David, but that's an introduction. We'll let David get away with that, artistic license. It starts with Aleph, Aromimcha, and it goes Aleph, Bet, Gimel, etc. So it's an acrostic, that's alphabetical. We'll get to all of this in our discussion. But we see that 145 is the heart of it, and 145, Tehillim 145, Psalm 145, Tehilah David, is featured very early on in Masechet Brachot as our example of the praise of the Tehillim you're supposed to say for God. So if we look, for example, in source 6 here, we have the Gemara. The Gemara tells us as follows. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, Amar Rabbi Avina. Rabbi Avina said, Kol ha'omer Tehilah David b'chol yom shlosh pa'amim. Anybody who says Tehilah David, Psalms 145, what we would now call Ashrei, 3 times a day. And we know in our practice, in our liturgy, we say Ashrei 3 times a day. We say it once in Psuki de Zimra. We say it once after Shemona Esrei, and once before Mincha. So anybody who says Tehilah David 3 times a day, Muvtach lo shehu ben olam haba. He is promised the portion in the world to come. And we know in rabbinic literature, this is one of the highest praises. This is one of the highest accolades. That means you did everything right. So this should stand out to us. First of all, point 1, very early precedent for reciting Ashrei every single day, regularly 3 times a day as part of our prayer. Point 2, it's not just that this is part of the liturgy, this is an important part of the liturgy. By saying Ashrei, you're Muvtach l'olam haba, you're guaranteed a place in the world to come. So one of the things I want us to think about tonight together, and hopefully we'll have somewhat of an answer for, is what is so special about Ashrei, that of all the praises, of all the halalukas, of everything, Ashrei is what makes you guaranteed for the world to come. Saying Ashrei 3 times a day is all you need. So that's one question to open up with before we continue with the Gemara. What's so special about Ashrei? Something to keep in the back of our minds. Continue now with the Gemara on Brachot 4b. So, the Gemara also finds this a little bit strange. Why should you get Olam Haba just from reciting Ashrei? So the Gemara says, my taima, what's the reason that Ashrei has such a special privileged status? Ilema, if you'll say, Mishum da'atia ba'alef bet, it's because Ashrei includes all of the Aleph bet. Nema Ashrei t'mimei derech, da'atia b'timnanya apen. So instead of saying Psalms 145, we should be saying Psalm 119, because Kufya Tet has all of the Aleph bet 8 times per letter. 8 Alephs, 8 bet, 8 Gimels, 8 Daleds. So it's all the better. So just to point out, the Gemara's first answer, or first assumption, or option, as to why one might think that Ashrei is significant, is super strange. Like, what's it mean because it involves all of the Aleph bet? Who cares that it has all of the Aleph bet? Does anyone have any ideas? I want to just put this to the floor. Why is it so important that Ashrei has all the Aleph bet in it? Why would that be enough justification for the Gemara to say that you get Olam Haba for saying it 3 times a day? Good. Sitting in silence will prepare us for activity.
No. All of the Aleph bet means that you've pretty much given this whole story of the Torah. They say if you say Ashrei 1 to 3 times a day, you have gone through. It's just like reading all of the Psalms. You've read all the Torah in
Beautiful. Beautiful. Lindy's touching on an idea that's actually brought up by the rabbis themselves in the Midrash, and we see gets a lot of play in later generations. That the reason why acrostics, alphabetical acrostics, are so significant in Judaism and across cultures, but we know for sure specifically in our liturgy, in Tefilah, we have all these alphabetical acrostics, is because what we're trying to express is some sense of totality. The praise for God is way more than we could actually ever explicate, but we're saying, you know what, God, we're using the whole letter of the alphabet, every letter of the alphabet. This is everything. It's as if we're saying every word you could ever put together from this alphabet. That somehow by going through the alphabet once, it's supposed to express that while we acknowledge we're limited in the praise we can give you, we're doing some formal structure to express totality. This is a unit. You are deserving of this praise. Interestingly enough, actually, this idea, this concept, that we're self-conscious about praising God enough, this is a major theological idea to the Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik saw a lot of the praise in Tefilah, in prayer, as being necessarily formalized. We need a rigid and formal liturgy even Psuki de Zimra, there's not room for individual prayer because, said the Rav, it's a slippery slope. You're going to praise God for one thing and not another thing? Who are you to praise God? Who are we to praise God? So therefore, our best bet is, instead of introducing individual prayer, to rely on a structure that the rabbis established so God can never get upset at us. God's going to say, you didn't praise me enough. We'll say, well, we did what the rabbis told us to, and you gave the rabbis authority. That it's our out of not being too afraid. So on the one hand, I think that really expresses like a powerful idea that we should be taking our prayer seriously, that we should be feeling this fear and anxiety, and that it's not nothing when we praise God. I think that's very moving. But I think overall, personally, and in our chabura together, I think what we would find more meaningful, what we would want to revive a little bit more, is less the anxiety of, oh no, am I praising God enough? And more, how can I make this praise more individually meaningful? But nonetheless, I totally agree, and I think that's a major part of the tradition and a completely legitimate answer. Part of what makes the Aleph Bet so important is a sense of totality, that it's a structure that gives us a holistic praise. Anyone else have any other ideas? Okay, I don't have anything too insightful to say. I'll just note that one of my friends wrote his thesis in college on mnemonics and memory structures in the Talmud Bavli, in the Gemara. And one of the things that he pointed out is that during a time when there's a lot of anxiety about transitioning to Torah Sheba'al Peh, it might make sense that something that's alphabetical and very easy to memorize, easy to remember, might be extra important, because you know for sure people won't forget it or mess it up. So it could be, if we had to pick, what's one of the best examples of Tefilah, of prayer, well, we'll pick a thing of Psalms that's easy to memorize. And the fact that it has the Aleph Bet, everyone's going to memorize it well. They'll know it really well, and we'll be sure we're transmitting and communicating completely accurately to God. That the Aleph Bet also has this mnemonic or memory skill that makes it a little bit easier to remember, and that could be extremely valuable during a time where everything's remembered. That said, I do just want to point out and mitigate this, that while some people make that point, and it is true, and certainly Aleph Bet is used as a mnemonic. First of all, the rabbis gave their own answer, and it's basically Lindy's answer. But also, second of all, just talking to some friends who work in academia, from our records of pre-printed archives, people had a shockingly accurate transmission of oral traditions. Nowadays, where we have easily printed paper, that's completely gone. Our memories and atrophy, that is just completely foreign to us. But there's actually a very good record of completely just long narratives, biblical type texts, all those type of texts just being completely memorized and transmitted. So while it's relatable to us that an Aleph Bet can make something easier to remember, and that's very appealing, I'm not sure it's so obvious that was necessary back then. So just throwing that out there, that it is an advantage, but not so clear that that's how people would interface with it. But nonetheless, our first explanation, why might Ashrei be special? Because it has the Aleph Bet. In response, the Gemara says, well, there's other things that have the Aleph Bet, and we know Tehillim Kuf Yotet has the Aleph Bet 8 times in a row. As a side note, when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I must have been like 7 or 8, I had just gotten comfortable reading Hebrew, and me and my friend, who was one of my rabbi's sons, and who was very influential in me getting involved in learning, we decided that we were going to read through all of Tehillim over a Shabbos. We were very from like 7-year-olds. I guess we were born in Connecticut. But when we got to Kuf Yotet, when we got up to Tehillim 119, where it has 8 verses per each one of the Aleph Bet, we just quit. We're like, all right, that's it. So that stuck with me, 20 years later. I remember that. Kuf Yotet's very intimidating, so thank God we don't have to say that 3 times a day every day. Ashrei is a much better option just because it's shorter. But for some reason, the rabbis seem to think longer is better. If Aleph Bet's good, then 8 Aleph Bets is even better. So Nema Ashrei T'mimei Derech, why don't we say this longer Ashrei that has that has Aleph Bet 8 times? Ella Mashum de Ispe Poteach et Yedecha. Rather, why is it that Ashrei is so important? Why is it that Tehillim 145 is so important? Because of the verse, Poteach et Yadecha. Open up your hand. That verse is so important that saying Ashrei 3 times a day merits you the world to come, just because it ensures you'll say that verse. Very, very moving idea. Then it says, Nema Hala Gadol dechtiv bein notin lechem lecho basar. Oh, are you really going to say that Ashrei is any different than Halal Gadol, than elsewhere, where in the Halal and Kuf Lamed Vav, we say that God gives bread to all people? Is that any different than God opens his hand for sustenance? Ela Mishum Desvei Tarti. So Gemara says, okay, I guess you're right, that's also significant. So it's because it's both alphabetical and because it contains Poteach et Yedecha. Just being alphabetical makes you a prime contender. But having Poteach et Yedecha, that makes you the most important chapter of Psalms. That's what we arrive at here in the Gemara in Brachot 4b. Why is it that Ashrei is important? 1, alphabetical. 2, it has the line of Pateach et Yedecha. And again, just to point out, this isn't like some sort of, it is a theological or philosophical discussion around Tefilah, but it's also, strictly speaking, a halachic argument. This expresses itself halachically. So we said before, for example, if one is rushed and can't recite all Psuki Zimra, they should just say Baruch She'amar, Ashrei, and Yishtabach. But if one's even too rushed to say Ashrei, the halacha is, you should say Pateach et Yedecha. Because the Gemara establishes the core of Ashrei, the reason why Ashrei is so significant is because of the verse, Pateach et Yedecha. So if you can't say all of Ashrei, the halacha is we learn from here, you should at least say Pateach et Yedecha. All that is to say, clearly, part of what makes Ashrei so special, part of what's so significant, is this verse. God opens up his hand, Pateach et Yedecha. So I just want to open up to the floor. Does anyone have any idea why Pateach et Yedecha? Why should that be so important?
Well, because if
Yes, were you saying
I
something?
I don't want to overstep.
Oh, is someone else talking?
I don't know. But so open up your hand. So if you open up your hand, that means you're open to everyone. You feed the people. It's like opening your hands and welcoming at the same time. You're welcoming people, and you're not closed and you're not pushing away.
Interesting. That's an interesting idea. Like it's maybe like the most open, welcoming expression.
You satisfy every living thing with favor.
Yeah.
So, but if you don't open your hand, how are you going to do that? And Margie can't unmute herself.
Oh no, Margie. Margie, have you tried holding the space bar while you talk? Because that'll unmute you while you talk.
Let me see what I can do.
All right, Jeff will try and help.
So to open up your hand, and so that you open your hand and you satisfy we're talking about God, every living thing with favor. That means you're accessible, that you provide.
Ah, beautiful. Exactly. I think that's a very powerful idea. So Lindy's pointing out two elements of this promise of God opening his hand. One is Pateach et Yedecha, that it's open, it's accessible, anyone can get there. And 2 is that it must be a Chocher Ratzon. God's accessible and he provides, he delivers. He provides for everybody. I think exactly along those lines. We see on the one hand, there's other verses that talk about God's sustenance. For example, we see that it talks about God giving bread, noting lechem l'chol basar. But something about this expression of sustenance is more open and more unique. I think that's a very powerful, right on track answer. Yeah, Margie, what were you going to say?
No, when I was thinking of the hand, that there's a lot of references to hands, particularly like back in Shemot with Moshe lifting the hand and miracles would happen. It seems like there's a lot of symbolism in hands and lifting hands, and an open hand is the opposite of a fist.
Oh, that's very nice too. So I think Margie's touching on a great idea also. That the idea, it's not just that God provides sustenance, that's God opens his hand. Pateach et Yedecha, that's also very moving.
So Rabbi, when you say you open your hands and satisfy the living with favor, you're opening your hands, you're also welcoming, it's like I said, like with Margie, you're welcoming the people. That you can't do anything if you're closed up like this, and if God is closed up like this, you can't approach him. Not that we can approach God, but you can approach God. So when he opens his hand to satisfy us, he's saying, come. He's saying, ask. He's saying, I have for you. I'll help you. But if he doesn't open his hands, that's not going there.
Oh,
like,
okay. So
you feel like someone's gonna come and save and I'll help you when they're like
beautiful.
This?
So I think that's spot on. I think exactly. I think we're all touching upon exactly what's going on here. Because okay, first of all, just to fully flesh out the question, I just want to point out, I jumped out a little bit, that the Sefer Eshkol points out, the Rav Avram ben Isaac of Narbonne, actually very interesting point. The Sefer Eshkol is written by Rav Avram ben Isaac, but he referred to himself as Rav Avram Av Beis Din, because he was the Av Beis Din of Narbonne at the time, which when it's spelled out is Rav Avram Av Beis Din Ravad. His son-in-law was the Ravid. So it's extremely confusing to ever figure out what's going on, because very often, like the Ravid will open up with Aleph Aleph, and is Aleph Aleph Omer Ani, Omer of Beitin, Omer of Ram, Omer Avi? Nobody knows. Like, is he talking from himself? Is he talking from his father-in-law? It's very confusing. But that is just some interesting side note that the Ravad has a son-in-law who's a Ravad. There's also a third Ravad over time, but that's even more confusing. We're not going to get into that. The Sefer Eshkol, though, is a very early recounting of Halacha. And perhaps, on the one hand, the strength of the Sefer Eshkol is that it's so early. It predates Rambam, it predates Rashi and many of the commentaries on the Gemara. It's a very early insight into how Halacha developed. The downside is that the Sefer Eshkol is extremely poorly organized, at least according to our conventions of organization today. So it's very hard to find things in the Sefer Eshkol. But nonetheless, somehow I came across a footnote that had a very fascinating explanation of the Sefer Eshkol, specifically that focuses on this idea of making sure to say Poteach Atidecha 3 times a day. And there the Eshkol explains that the Lefi Shetihila David Davar Gadol, since this psalm was a great matter, a large matter, an important matter, Tiknu Lomar Begimel Zmanim. They established you should say it 3 times. Why? She'imlo kiven ba'achat, yikaven ba'acherot. So if you don't have proper kavana, proper intent, when you recite the words, Poteach et yadecha, umaspia lechocha ratzon, God who opens his hands and provides sustenance, that if in Shachris you don't have proper intent, you can make sure to have intent later on in the day. In other words, says the Eshkol, it's not that there's something significant about reciting 3 times a day, Ashrei. It's that Ashrei is so important, we're going to give you 3 chances to do it right at least once. You have to do it right at least once. This idea of Ashrei, and more specifically the focus on Poteach et Yadecha, that's so important that it must be done right once. So,
can you add something? The Sephardim have added, because Ashkenazim may not have the right kavana all the time. The Sephardim have the custom of opening their hand, actually being demonstrative and saying, and I learned that from them. I think, and that helps you understand the pasuk. I mean, it helps you concentrate on the pasuk.
That's beautiful. That makes a lot of sense. I always wondered where that minhag came from. So because there's a special halacha to have concentration on the pasuk, or it doesn't count, the minhag of Sephardim was to open their hands to focus on it. Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you, Jeff. All right, maybe I'll start doing that. But all right, great. So we see that, but what we see is clearly that this is like the essence. This is the ikar, the heart of Ashrei. So I want to share the insight of one of my rabbis, Professor Bick, who he actually has a book on Shemona Esrei, and he has a book on the 13 attributes of mercy that we recite on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. So he writes about Tefilah, he writes a bit about prayer. When I was in the Gush, he used to do an 11:30 p.m. prayer chabura, Tefilah chabura, where we would go over the text of the Siddur together. And when we got up to Ashrei, he pointed out, and I think this really touches on what Lindy and Margie are saying as well, that part of what's so special about the verse of Poteach et Yadecha, Maspil Chocharatzon, is like the Gemara says, it's a verse about of sustenance, of God providing sustenance like any other. God gives food, God gives bread, and in that regard, it's just one of many examples of God providing sustenance. Were it not for the fact that Ashrei is also an Aleph Bet, maybe it wouldn't have even been so special. But on the other hand, the Poteach et Yadecha is particularly noteworthy for some of the themes that Lindy and Margie were touching upon. More specifically, that the image, the vision of God stretching out his hand, obviously textually, historically invokes Mitzrayim. It invokes our relationship with God in Egypt. But even more than that, the reason why it invokes that, the reason why God is described as using a hand or a finger or personally going and dealing with the Egyptians, is because it's one of the clearest and openest expressions of God's ability to intervene with nature for the sake of the Jewish people. That is God's hand. God shows his hand when he visibly, observably is changing nature. That's why we say, oh, there's God's hand, because we can see it, we can note it. And the idea of Poteach et Yadecha is this idea that God is so concerned, so prioritized with our sustenance, our well-being, that even nature itself can be subverted for the sake of the Jewish people. And said Rav Dick, perhaps that is why it's such an essential introductory pasuk, because at the heart of prayer is this claim. Prayer itself is the claim that nature can be reversed so God can help. And we discussed in our earlier introductory shiurim, is that really what we should be focusing on? Is that the mechanics of prayer? And that's a very important discussion, and that's worthwhile. But nonetheless, on some level, we all agree that what we're doing for prayer is turning to God and saying, I need your help. God, you can help. So Poteach et Yadecha crystallizes that by saying that God is the one who has a hand to outstretch from his abode, from his domain, into our domain. That God can reach out, subvert the laws of nature, the laws of humanity, and do what he wants for the sake of the Jewish people. And that's important if you're truly going to appreciate, truly going to have the proper kavanah for prayer. There's no way you can properly approach God in Shemona Esrei if you haven't internalized the essence of prayer. That God provides everything for everyone, and that even things that appear as nature are stemming from God's hand, God's ability to provide. So that's an essential idea, that all provision is really a supernatural act of care from God. God can subvert nature if he wants to, because he's also the one who maintains it. And that's perhaps at the core of Poteach et Yadecha according to Rabbi. That said, I think any other interpretation is just as equally valid here. As we saw in the Gemara, the pshat is, it's a combo. It's the fact that it's both Poteach et Yadecha, it's about sustenance, and that it's an aleph bet, that it's a particularly inclusive, formalized totality of praise for God. So those two things go hand in hand together, and that leads us with our halachic conclusion that Ashrei is the core of Psukei Zimra. If one can only recite one thing in Psukei Zimra, they should make sure to say Ashrei. And more specifically, Poteach et Yadecha, the pay verse, is the heart of Ashrei, and one should have special kavanah that they properly recite it. Just also pointing out, as is our general standard in halacha, and as the Eshkol is really bringing to light here, even though there's an emphasis on having kavanah and having proper intent, if you don't have proper intent, you'll just get it next time. The halacha isn't that you should say it again. It's that, okay, mincha you'll have proper intent, the next Ashrei you'll have proper intent in the Eshkol, because nowadays we assume if you miss it the first time, you're not going to do any better the second time. So just pointing out, it's an interesting idea we have here early on. Ashrei is multiple Ashreis for multiple chances. Yeah, Jeff, were you raising your hand?
There is a fly in the ointment in the mnemonic approach to this.
Yeah.
It's not Aleph to Tav because there's one letter that's missing.
Beautiful. Jeff is bringing us to our next discussion point.
Okay, good.
Jeff, which letter is missing for everybody?
None.
The nun. If everybody goes and looks at the Ashrei, we'll see famously that there's no letter for nun. It goes Machutcha Machut Kol Mem, which is a mem, to Somech Hashem L'Kol Noflem, the Samech. It skips the nun. So why does Ashrei skip the nun? So we're not the first people to ever ask this, of course. The first people to write it down, at least, was the Gemara. The Gemara noticed this as too. It's unusual that we're missing a nun, particularly unusual we're missing a nun, when we just said the reason why this matters is because it has all of the alphabet. So the Gemara in Bracha 4b, continuing, and where we put it above, it asks this question. But actually, even before that, I just want to point out also, I'll get to that actually, Okay, so the Gemara asks this question. And the Gemara says as follows, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Mipnei ma lo nemar nun ba'ashrei. Why is there no nun in Ashrei? Why is there no verse that says there's a nun? Mipnei sheyishba mapalatan shel sonei Yisrael. Because it contains, it talks about the downfall of those who hate Israel. And I know you're all thinking that's very confusing. Shouldn't that be a great thing, the downfall of those who hate Israel? But we should all know that the Gemara and the rabbis talk about what's known as Lashon Sagi Nahor. Sagi Nahor literally is Aramaic for sufficient light. And that's the Aramaic term for a blind person. Because in the Gemara, in the language of the rabbis, there's a preference that when something is viewed, perhaps we wouldn't stigmatize blindness as they would, but when something is viewed as being very negative or very, very horrible or tragic, rather than expressing it, we should express the opposite of it and learn from implication. So he's not blind, he has sufficient light. Similarly, one clear example, the Gemara, the rabbis will never say anybody cursed God with the verb kalel, to curse. The Aramaic rabbinic expression for cursing God is levarech et Hashem, to bless God. And you know that from opposites, clearly that means to curse. So too here, who are the Sonei Yisrael, those who hate Israel? The Bnei Yisrael, the Jews. When the Gemara says it talks about the downfall of Israel's enemies, that's Lashon Sagi Nahor. That's the rabbis not being able to bring themselves to articulate the downfall of the Jewish people. So they say the downfall of the Jewish enemies. But it's very complicated and confusing when they do that. But trust me, Rashi agrees, everybody agrees, we're talking about the downfall of the Jewish people here. So why is it that we don't have a nun? The Gemara gives a very strange answer. Because obviously the only nun that would fit talks about the downfall of the Jewish people. And then it goes and it quotes a pasuk. And not only does it quote a pasuk, it quotes a pasuk from Amos, which is not in Ketuvim, not in Tehillim at all, it's prophets. And the pasuk says, Nafla lo tosif kum betulat Yisrael. that the virgin of Israel has fallen and shall no longer arise. And this is when Amos is prophesying about the destruction that's going to befall the Jewish people. Clearly a negative verse. So says the Gemara, for some reason, were David to have written a nun for Ashrei, he obviously would have had to use this verse from Amos, which took place hundreds of years later. And since David obviously had to use this verse from Amos, which was about the downfall of the Jewish people, he didn't want to write it. Very, very strange. But okay, that's the Gemara's answer. Somehow it was destined to be negative and we had to leave it out. B'ma'arava mitarzi. In the West, in Israel, they have a different answer. Mitarzi lahachi. The answer follows. Nafla v'lo tosif linpol od kum b'tulat Yisrael. So I think it's a slightly different pasuk. Let me see, where's this one from? Oh no, it's the same pasuk. Okay, it's the exact same pasuk. Amr Reb Nachman Yitzchak. Reb Nachman Yitzchak says. No, it's a slightly different pasuk. Yeah, the first one is Nafla lo tosif kum b'tulat Yisrael. This one is Nafla v'lo tosif linpol od kum b'tulat Yisrael. Okay, fine. But so in Israel, they explained, in the West, in Israel, they explained that it's not just that the Jewish people have fallen and can't arise, it's v'lo tosif linpol od. They'll never fall again. It's a particularly negative prophecy. This is the final dooming downfall of the Jewish people, therefore, we can't mention it. Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Filu hachi, even if that's the case, Chazar David, Usam Chan Baruch HaKodesh. Nonetheless, David made sure to somehow get a hint in there with the divine spirit that filled him. Shnei Amar, as the pasuk says, Samech Hashem l'chol hanoflim. Hashem lifts up, supports anyone who falls. So we just said, what was the verse supposed to be? The Jewish people will fall. So we leave that one out, and the immediately next one we say is, God lifts up those who fall. So all of this is to say that according to the Gemara, there should have been a nun. This really is a perfect alphabetical acrostic, but there was a need, a necessity to remove the nun, to take the nun out of the acrostic, take it out, and that's why we took it out. So, of course, this is extremely strange. What does it mean that this later pasuk from Amos had to have been the verse? And we're not the only ones to find it strange, because, for example, when you look in Radak, Rav David Kimchi, one of the very earliest and most important commentators on Tanakh, Radak says as follows: HaMizmor Hazeh Tehillah Lakel. This Mizmor of Ashrei is a praise to God, Yitbarach, blessed is He. The Ficha Chibru Ba'alef Bet. That's why it's in the Aleph Bet, because it's a praise to God. Like we mentioned, praises to God need structure, lest they be overly ambitious. Fine. V'lo chiber et nun, and there's no nun. V'lo yidanu lama, and we don't know why. And I know you might be thinking, what do you mean we don't know why? We just said, the Gemara says. Did Radak not know the Gemara? No. Radak knew the Gemara. The Radak goes on and says, Dear Shurazal, the rabbis darshan, they expounded, Israel. It's because it means the downfall of the Jewish people. But nonetheless, Radak recognized that's not a historical claim. Lo yidanu lama. We don't know historically why there's no nun. That's an explanation from Chazal that whatever it is, whatever reason David had, whatever reason the liturgy had, whatever it is, this is the meaning we can find in why there's no nun. And it's very meaningful. It's a beautiful idea. But even the Radak acknowledges this is a very peculiar historical claim. David knew and he had to use Amos's verse, and therefore David left it. Radak's not willing to accept that as simple history. So I just want to point out that one final point before I make my heretical claim here. Rabbi Shalom Karmi, he's a rabbi at YU, he focuses a lot on philosophy, issues of biblical criticism and biblical commentary. He's an expert in every philosophical, theological, conceptual field you could find. It's a little daunting, the extent of his breadth of knowledge. But in particular, he likes to write about these like little peculiarities that come up in Jewish tradition. So unsurprisingly, he has an article in the Shiur blog where he focuses on the missing nun. And in that article, in the Shiur blog, you can read the quote for yourself if you want, but I'll just explain it outside for time. We're running short. He basically points out that he came across a poem by Auden, called Auden's Atlantis, and in it, the poet very notably leaves out a verse that he telegraphs that there should be a verse, there should be a poetic verse, and the poet leaves the verse out for dramatic effect. And says Rav Karmi, maybe what we have here is not a literal claim that David had to use the verse from Amos, but rather what David's doing is, David, or the author of this, presumably David, that what David's doing here is he's illustrating to us through poetic omission. David intentionally leaves out the nun, knowing that nun often is associated with nafal, to fall. But if that wasn't enough, David makes a point to include the word nafal in the next verse, and somech in the next verse, not because of mystical ruach hakodesh that he knew that was the verse, but because David knew by mentioning nafal, it would invoke falling. It would make it clear that this poem, this ashrei, is going out of its way to not mention the downfall of the Jewish people, because it's entirely dedicated to how the Jewish people will be built up and how praiseworthy God is for building them up. So that's his claim. In secular literature too, sometimes we see a telegraphed poetic omission. Yeah, Jeff.
This is just the one exception, because I know subsequent to this, I mean, let's say achdumot and slichot, you have all of these acrostics, and they're all alphabetical. The nun is there every single time.
It's a beautiful point, right? If it's really such a problem to have a nun, then what about every single other acrostic? So that is an excellent point. And so now here's my heresy that I'll point out, and I'm not going to have a great answer. It's just, we'll talk about it. But it turns out that in earlier records of Ashrei, and in the Septuagint, and in other translations, there is a nun. In Dead Sea Scrolls and earlier records, there is a nun pasuk. And the nun pasuk did exist. But for whatever reason, either it was removed, maybe it was intentionally removed for this purpose. And then you have Jeff's question, why only this nun and no other nun? Maybe it was forgotten, maybe it fell out. Over time, the nun is missing. And by the time Chazal had their version of Tehillim, there was no nun. Could be that was a mistake. Maybe the versions we find with a nun are, mistakes, and that's why we found them. Maybe they were buried because, they were shamos. Unclear, we don't know, but what we do know for sure is that historically, there at least were versions of Ashrei with a nun. Nowadays, we don't have a nun, and we don't know why. Like the Radak said, Lo Yidanu Lama. We have a nice idea from the rabbis, we have maybe Rav Karmi's idea, but we're left with this question. So what I want to take this as our opportunity to transition to our activity tonight. And what I want for our activity tonight, I mentioned that unfortunately, Rose Singer has one activity about Psuki de Zimra, and we have about 12 shiurim on it. So every once in a while, we're going to have to go off script with the book. But one thing what I wanted to do tonight together is in the theme, in the notion of this missing nun, or this idea that there's a letter, there's a verse, there's something missing from Ashrei. I wanted all of us just to take the next 5 minutes to read through Ashrei together and to ask ourselves, what's missing? What is it that we would include? What is something that we could include in our own Ashrei the next time we daven, in our Psuki de Zimra, the next time we prepare for our prayer? What is missing other than the nun? Hopefully by reading the prayer and the praises that David did write, it'll invoke in us, it'll inspire in us an idea of what else could have been there. And then we'll all get together, and whoever would like to will share what's missing from Ashrei from them. And then in the week forward, hopefully we can incorporate that into our Ashrei prayer. So for now, everyone will have 5 minutes. We'll take 5 minutes, look over Ashrei, and ask yourself, what's your nun? What's your missing element of Ashrei? One minute warning, and then we'll get back together and share. more seconds. All right. Everyone can slowly come back. Anyone wants to start us off and share something that you felt was missing from your Ashrei, from your Psuki de Zimra, after reading through Ashrei? Anyone want to go first? Not everybody at once. Paul, if you laugh, you legally have to share. No, I'm kidding. You don't have to. You don't have to.
I thought what was missing is hope.
Beautiful. I was struck by a lot of what we praise God for in Ashrei is actually very physical, and I felt like it was missing a lot of the emotional and supportive elements God deserves praise for.
Hope jumped out at me.
Yeah, I think it's very similar. Great point. Anyone else? All right. Nobody has to if you don't want to. I'll acknowledge that I'm not as seasoned as this as Reb Dov is, but I'll keep working on it. Hopefully this gave everybody an opportunity to reflect on Ashrei a little bit, find some personal meaning in it, and we'll continue next week. So thank you, everybody.